Is bad news for the vital tourism industry. Scott Heidler has more from Bangkok on the restart business.
Businesses are gradually reopening, but economic recovery is far from certain.
And he emphasized the necessity for the government to provide assistance to those businesses to help restart the economy here. The economy in Thailand was the worst hit in Southeast Asia from the COVID crisis. He says that things are there moving forward, but it's very critical to keep a close eye because any uptick in the numbers of COVID cases in Thailand could derail that progress.
Restrictions have been eased in Australia's most populous state after a 2-month lockdown. Public gatherings of up to 10 people are now allowed in New South Wales, and restaurants and cafes have been reopening. Authorities have urged people to maintain social distancing. The state recorded 8 new cases in the past, bringing the total there to just over 3,000. China has gone a month without announcing any new deaths from the coronavirus, and it reported just 4 new cases on Friday. There's also been a significant boost in production as the economy shows signs of picking up. Katrina Yu is in Beijing with the details.
So the Chinese government here is at pains to emphasize that the momentum is looking good, that there is a steady recovery and that these figures are better than expected. But of course, the devil is in the detail. And what we are seeing, if we look deeper into these figures, is that the Chinese economy is still struggling to recover from the COVID-19 standstill. So industrial production has rebounded. That is up 3.9% year on year and up from a 1.1% fall in March. So those numbers are looking good. Retail sales, unfortunately, are down. They fell by 7.5%, which is even worse than what some analysts forecasted. They forecasted a 6% fall, and that's key because the Chinese economy is very much powered by domestic consumption. Fixed asset investment was also down. People aren't buying property here. It's 10.3% lower. And urban unemployment rose slightly. That's at 6%, and that's up 0.1% from March. Now, that figure in particular is one to pay attention to. Unemployment is a big issue here in China because the government sees it as key to social stability. But at the same time, it's very difficult to get accurate data on unemployment figures here. Analysts say urban unemployment could be spiking, and we could see about 22 million people lose their jobs, and that's just in cities. Of course, China has a huge migrant worker population, and some estimates are saying that there could be as many as 80 to 100 million people losing their jobs across China, and that would spell a lot of trouble.
Germany's economy has suffered its sharpest decline since the 2009 financial crisis. Europe's biggest economy shrank 2.2% in the first quarter compared to last year. The lockdowns imposed in mid-March drastically cut exports and spending. Restrictions were eased at the end of last month. A number of European countries have started reopening their borders with heavy restrictions. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia are now allowing citizens to travel between the 3 countries in what's being called the EU's first travel bubble. In Spain, a 14-day mandatory quarantine is being enforced for people allowed back in. The EU had earlier recommended its members close borders completely until May the 15th. Meanwhile, measures have been easing in England this week. Certain workers are now back on the job, and people can also spend more time outside. But there have been concerns that it's moving too quickly, and that could spark a second wave of infections. The UK is one of the hardest hit countries in the world, with more than 33,000 deaths. Jonah Hull has more from London on how this is working in practice.
The concern is now quite widespread that this is happening far too soon, far too fast, albeit these are only the very slightest easings of the lockdown, and only here in England. The devolved administrations in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales have continued to be cautious. They're not taking these steps just yet, but here, as of the beginning of this week, if you weren't able to do your job from home, but you do work or are able to work in a socially distanced, COVID-friendly environment, you were encouraged to go back to work. That affected mainly sort sort of construction and manufacturing environments, disproportionately perhaps affecting lower paid, lower skilled workers. There are also greater freedoms of movement in the country's parks and recreation spaces. The government's messaging has changed from stay home to stay alert, and the central piece of guidance being offered is exercise common sense as you go about your business in terms of maintaining social distancing. It's all provoked no shortage of criticism and confusion about just what this new policy actually means. Are people supposed to, in general, continue to stay at home and observe the lockdown and continue to inhibit the pathways to infection and the spread of the virus? Or can they more or less freely now go about outside as long as they exercise common sense? And anecdotally, I can tell you here in London, there is a lot of evidence of small shops, independent cafes, coffee shops, small restaurants opening up for takeaways, clearly testing the waters and the limits of this guidance.
While the pandemic has left many employees on furlough or working from home, couriers have been busier than ever. But some companies in the United Kingdom are being criticised for failing to provide equipment necessary to ensure their safety. Sonia Gallego reports now from London.
It's a very busy time for self-employed courier Paul Hughes. He's delivering twice as many packages than before the UK went into lockdown. As well as the increased workload, keeping safe is also a priority. And that would usually involve using personal protective equipment or PPE.
It's quite difficult because, first of all, you have to get over the normal way you interact with people, and it feels rude at first. Unfortunately, I think the government have fallen a bit behind the ball with all this one and getting PPE in place.
As key workers providing an essential service, couriers are supposed to be guaranteed a measure of safety by the companies they work for. But because they are technically self-employed, they are not guaranteed sick pay. And many feel obliged to work even if they are unwell. And that poses a health risk to their families and the people they interact with. While there has been pressure on the government to provide healthcare workers with PPE, some of the companies hiring couriers are accused of overlooking their safety.
It's a very poor response as far as I'm concerned. Recently, they've started to have this sort of, I want to say, weekly conversation with us. But at this point, as far as I'm concerned, it's too little too late.
Workers at this company behind me complained that at the start of the lockdown, at one distribution point, they were being forced to go out without any protective equipment. Now, the company has since started providing masks, gloves and hand sanitizers, but the question remains as to how they could be forced to do that when they were facing an increased workload as well as risk of infection. The company has said that it had been, quote, guided by the latest government advice and remained responsive to the latest updates. As the UK loosens its lockdown, the unions representing workers say their members will still need those protections in place.
We still don't have clear rules and regulations in place over face coverings against other countries, and this clearly is a matter of concern.
And that's led to many saying protections must be guaranteed for those providing a crucial service during this pandemic. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, still to come here on Al Jazeera. Fearing an outbreak, the first COVID-19 case reported in large refugee camps in Bangladesh. And Colombia's government begins to reopen the economy, but critics warn it's far too soon.
Hello, we've got more heavy rain into central parts of China at the moment, easing over towards southern areas of Japan. Long line of cloud here. You can see the weather systems affecting those particular areas. The seasonal showers continuing then across southern parts of China. Things a little more mobile further north as well, up towards Siberia. And as that mobile air pushes through, slightly warmer weather starts to ease its way in. And that has led to the ice melt that we have in Siberia. And as per usual, we're looking at some very high river levels in places and some flooding. Further showers here as we go through Saturday. Further showers, longer spells of rain into central and southern parts of Japan, linking all the way back into central China. and down towards the southeastern corner. And a similar picture as we go on through Sunday. Heavier rain starts to push away from Honshu, from Kyushu. Temperatures in Tokyo at around 27 Celsius. That wetter weather slides out of Siberia and that pushes towards the far northeast of China. Beijing at around 25 Celsius. Meanwhile, some very heavy showers affecting southern parts of India at the moment. We have got this circulation here that may well develop into a tropical cyclone over the next couple of days. We're hopeful it'll stay offshore, at least for the time being. Elsewhere, it's hot and dry.
A story of love, family, and freedom.
I was 8 years old. We were at school. We heard the sound of large explosions.
And the hardships faced in captivity.
They came for me at midnight. They told me to leave my son. I said, how can I? I saw so much pain in the eyes of the other female prisoners.
Naila and the Uprising on Al Jazeera.
Welcome back. You're watching Al Jazeera with me, Sahil Ramna. A reminder of our top stories. The Independent Police Complaints Council in Hong Kong says the force generally acted within guidelines during last year's protests, though it said there was room for improvement. The watchdog has been looking into allegations of misconduct and brutality. Also, Thailand has announced that it'll be reopening department stores, shopping centres and food courts as it winds down its restrictions. International flights are still banned, however, straining the country's tourism industry. And Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia have reopened their borders to each other in what's been described as the EU's first travel bubble. A number of European countries have started relaxing their rules. The EU had earlier recommended that members close borders completely until May the 15th. Mass testing for coronavirus is underway in the worst affected areas of Kenya, but many are reluctant to be checked for fear of being forced into quarantine. Catherine Sawyer reports now from the capital, Nairobi.
Jared Onyancha is a COVID-19 survivor. He works as a guard in a quarantine center in Nairobi. He says he was infected there in March and after about a month was discharged from hospital. His employer paid the bill of $400. He tells us his biggest problem is the stigma surrounding infection.
People are afraid of me at work. I can't even get close to anyone. They shun me and say I'm coronavirus. Even at home, people don't want to associate with me. I feel lonely and quite sad sometimes.
The woman who recorded this video for Al Jazeera remains in quarantine after recently returning from China. She says she didn't expect the poor sanitary conditions in the Kenyan government's quarantine center or being forced to pay for her stay, despite the government recently agreeing to cover all expenses. Some people in mandatory quarantine have attempted to escape, and several others have sued the government for violating their rights.
We have not been given masks, no gloves, So the issue of quarantine centers being breeding grounds, it is very high likely that you can come when you're not sick and you get infected.
Government officials say they are addressing the complaints, but blame some Kenyans for not taking social distancing measures seriously, as the number of people infected continues to rise and spread within communities. That's caused drastic measures to be enforced, including banning travel in and out of Nairobi, as well as some counties on the coast. This is a police barrier on the edge of one of the most affected neighborhoods in the city. People are not allowed to go in or leave the area, which is a major trading hub. Mass testing for COVID-19 is also going on. But many Kenyans are reluctant to get tested. Some say they're afraid they will be forced into quarantine. Health experts are concerned that the government emergency response strategy may fail to flatten the curve.
You militarize or you police a public health issue, then you'll expect that people will find ways of not adhering or running away. If you're expecting people to adhere to those things, you need to approach it in a different way. And this way is not to be hard on people, is not to militarize, is to have somebody take people through slowly, explain, have people understand.
Back at Onyancha's home, he says he's lucky to be alive and is ready to return to work. He also hopes that his neighbors, friends and colleagues will soon stop seeing him as a threat to their health. Catherine Soy, Al Jazeera, Nairobi, Kenya.
It's been 72 years since hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forcibly evicted from their land to make way for the creation of Israel. The day is known as Al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. Unlike previous years, no rallies or protests are happening because of the coronavirus pandemic. Nida Ibrahim has more from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank.
As there is a ban on gatherings, Palestinians are not going to be going to Ramallah downtown, as has been the habit every year. And they've been instead asked to commemorate the day on social media, sharing stories, videos of people who survived the Nakba, who are still alive until now, or their children or grandchildren, to tell stories of how Palestinians will keep valuing the right of return, and that they will never forget that they have lands and houses that they have been either evicted from or that they have to flee from because of the war back then. Now, looking at the current political situation, the dreams of refugees seem to be fading away, with Israel not only rejecting them, the whole idea of return, but also that Israel is looking now for grabbing more lands. We are expecting an Israeli government in the next few days, an annexation of parts of the Jordan Valley and the illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank are high on its agenda. It's worth mentioning that this is the second anniversary of the U.S. moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It was a big sign and a big big move of support by the U.S. to Israel. They've announced that they recognize Jerusalem to be the Israeli capital. Of course, Palestinians have long said that they have United Nations Security Council resolutions saying that this is their land, but also that Jerusalem is their capital.
A Rohingya man has become the first person to test positive for COVID-19 inside a refugee camp in Bangladesh. Now, it's feared the virus could race through the settlements in Cox's Bazar. With nearly 1 million people living there, social distancing is difficult and access to running water limited. Louise Donovan is a spokeswoman for the UN's refugee agency in Cox's Bazar. She says more resources are needed.
It's a very worrying development today with the first positive case within the refugee camps. So far, just 108 tests have been done amongst the refugee population. But in the Cox's Bazar district, the number is continuing to increase. We have 134 cases in Cox's Bazar district today. And in Bangladesh, more generally, the numbers have surpassed 17,000. So the numbers continue to increase. There is a shortage of testing. However, it is increasing. Testing only began in Cox's Bazar at the beginning of April. So we're continuing to increase the testing. What's particularly important for us at the moment is to establish adequate response capacity. We've been putting preparatory measures in place with the government and partners since the beginning of March, but at the moment what we need is to have adequate facilities to cater for people who may be infected. Social distancing is extremely difficult. It's the biggest refugee population in the world. We have more than 40,000 people per living per square kilometre, so it's very, very challenging. In terms of hygiene promotion, we have established hand washing facilities all over the camps. We're increasing soap distributions, and in terms of response capacity, UNHCR has established 2 isolation and treatment facilities which should be operational from next week. Other partners are also establishing isolation and treatment facilities and also quarantine facilities. So basically anybody who is identified as being COVID-19 positive, all contacts, there will be contact tracing and these people will be put into quarantine. At the moment, the target is to have 1,900 isolation and treatment beds available, which would be both for the refugee population and the local Bangladeshi population. But at the moment, we haven't reached that target.
A powerful storm in the eastern Philippines has forced tens of thousands of people into emergency shelters. Severe winds have destroyed homes and cut off power supplies on the central island of Samar. Typhoon Vongfong has now been downgraded to a tropical storm. Rescue efforts are being complicated by coronavirus restrictions. The government in Colombia has allowed businesses doing vital jobs to reopen after a 7-week lockdown. But as Alessandro Rampietti reports now from Bogota, getting to work isn't the same as it was.
Officials are taking no chances at this bus station in Bogota, strictly enforcing coronavirus distancing measures to control the number of passengers on each bus and inside the station. As more than 2 million people in the sprawling city go back to work for the first time in 50 days.
I am a bit worried, but it reassures me that they are enforcing order and preventive measures. With God's help, I'd buy a motorcycle to be safer, but for now, it's not an option.
Officially, the national quarantine continues here until May 25th. But traffic is back, and President Ivan Duque has allowed the reopening of key sectors of the economy, and for many, it couldn't have happened soon enough. At this construction site, workers are back, but have to go through temperature checks and painstaking disinfection process for themselves and their equipment.
We complied with all the requirements and protocols of the city government, and fortunately we were allowed to restart. This is a very important sector of the economy. It employs many people. It was key to reopen and in a safe manner.
Yet despite the protocols, the return of economic activity remains controversial. The mayor of Bogota in particular has been a staunch critic of the national government decision to reopen, saying that the number of coronavirus cases keeps rising on a daily basis and that the peak of infections will only arrive at some point in late June. With the measures relaxed, unauthorized people are crowding the streets, especially informal vendors and others who live hand to mouth. To lessen the impact, the mayor has imposed a color-coded zoning system. People living in high-risk areas need to remain home, with health brigades and police enforcing orders.
I think obviously the government is in a tough dilemma because we all knew that they faced the risk of opening too soon, and that could create a second wave of contagion. But if they didn't, that would even create more problems on the economy. But at the same time, it's unclear if the government has increased its capabilities on testing, the ICU capabilities throughout the country, and contact tracing.
A risky but some say necessary move in a country with many economic needs. Although with infections still rising and the number of available intensive care units shrinking, it could end up being too much too soon. Alessandro Rampietti, Al Jazeera, Bogota.
American doctors and engineers have developed 2 devices to help fight against COVID-19. The staff at the University of Michigan designed a so-called portable helmet, as well as a negative pressure tent. Now, both prevent infected air from escaping into the wider environment. Sridhar Kota is a co-inventor of those devices and founder of Flexis, an aerospace company. He says they'll have applications beyond coronavirus treatment.
Even the patients who are on ventilators, they can be moved to this device, and only severe cases, we can spare ventilators for most critical cases. There is another variation of this negative pressure helmet, which is a negative pressure tent that allows doctors to perform various procedures like tracheostomy and bronchoscopy and things that they are not doing right now on COVID patients because of aerosolization. There's a great risk for the healthcare workers when you're treating patients this way. So this negative pressure tent allows them to treat patients with procedures that they badly need, and so that way the patient can be taken off the ventilator sooner and treated accordingly. We talk about the social distancing, and so certainly when the patient comes into an ambulance, or where now the healthcare workers are exposed to the virus, whereas if you have this negative pressure helmet on the patient, so the people around them are not infected with the virus, even before entering the hospital. So you could also use this in the public spaces as well. But once the patient enters the hospital, if the patient needs a treatment, you can provide oxygen through the helmet and treat the patient that way. And for larger procedures, I mentioned already about the tent. So this goes beyond the use for COVID and for other infectious diseases as well.
The Japanese government is urging the International Olympic Committee to fully share the cost of postponing the Tokyo 2020 Games. On Thursday, the IOC announced it was setting aside $800 million to deal with the effects of COVID-19, but that's unlikely to be enough.
At the meeting between the IOC and the Organising Committee on the 16th of April, the IOC and Japan agreed to jointly deal with the effects of the postponement, including costs, and that we will jointly evaluate and hold discussions. We will continue to pay close attention to the progress of discussions between the IOC, the Organising Committee, and Tokyo's metropolitan government.
You're watching Al Jazeera with me, Sahil Rahman. A reminder of our top stories. The Independent Police Complaints Council in Hong Kong says the force generally acted within guidelines during last year's protests, though it said there was room for improvement. The watchdog has been looking into allegations of misconduct and brutality. Thailand has announced that it'll be reopening department stores, shopping centres and food courts as it winds down its restrictions. International flights are still banned, however, straining the country's tourism industry. Scott Heidler has more from Bangkok.
Now they're going to open shopping malls. That's where we're standing at Central World. This is one of these big shopping complexes. If you've ever been to downtown Bangkok, the central district here in downtown Bangkok, several of the main subway stops, or I should say metro stops, SkyTrain stops, have these massive shopping complexes connected to them. We're at one of them, and they're very happy that they'll be finally opening after several weeks, multiple weeks, almost 2 months that they were shut down. So obviously that's something that's important to the economy here, but also it's really a quality of life issue for a lot of the people that live here in Bangkok.
Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia have reopened their borders to each other in what's being described as the EU's first travel bubble. A number of European countries have started relaxing their rules. The EU had earlier recommended members close borders completely until May the 15th. China's economy is showing signs of gradual improvement after its lockdowns were eased. Its industrial output 3.9% in April compared to last year, but unemployment is higher and retail sales have fallen further than expected. A Rohingya man has become the first person to test positive for COVID-19 inside a refugee camp in Bangladesh. Now, it's feared the virus could race through the settlements in Cox's Bazar. With nearly 1 million people living there, social distancing is difficult and access to running water limited. A powerful storm in the eastern Philippines has forced tens of thousands of people into emergency shelters. Many fear Typhoon Vongfong could cause catastrophic landslides. It has now been downgraded into a tropical storm. Rescue efforts are being complicated by restrictions aimed at preventing the spread of coronavirus. Those were the headlines. More news in half an hour with Peter Dobby. Next, talk to Al Jazeera.
September 2016, nearly 2 months before the then presidential candidate Donald Trump's election, President Barack Obama spoke at the UN General Assembly.
As I address this hall as president for the final time, let me recount the progress that we've made a quarter century after the end of the Cold War. The world is by many measures less violent and more prosperous than ever before.
But with millions of people displaced worldwide, unresolved conflicts from Yemen to Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan, and armed groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda launching attacks against civilians, was President Obama's speech too optimistic? His top UN diplomat at the time was Ambassador Samantha Power, who was responsible for securing international consensus on a variety of pressing issues at the Security Council and General Assembly.
I'm James Bays at the United Nations in New York. How has US foreign policy changed since President Trump took office and what should have been done differently? And with the next presidential elections in November, will Ambassador Power pursue a new political role in Washington? The former US ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, talks to Al Jazeera. Ambassador Samantha Power, former US ambassador to the UN, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. Let me start from having read your recent memoir and ask you to rewind to November 2016. You were still the US ambassador. It was election night. You had a party for all the female ambassadors of the UN. You invited them to your then residence at the top of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel to celebrate, I think, what you thought was going to be the election of a President Clinton. Can I ask you your thoughts on that night and now how things stand in the world after 3.5, nearly 4 years of a Trump administration?
Well, James, it was a grim night. We had started off assuming that America would be electing its first female president. That would have profound effects potentially for what seemed possible all around the world, as America leads as a very powerful country no matter what it does, good or bad. And instead, here was the election of someone that had made clear that he had very little appetite for America's alliances, that he had very little faith in multilateral action and in international institutions. Even traditional Republican stalwarts like NATO had come under attack. He had made clear that he didn't really see America in the inclusive way that we had long seen ourselves, making it clear that immigrants were not welcome, making clear that certain minority groups should feel out of place. And of course, he had said that he was going to put in place a ban on travel from Muslim countries. And so there were people in the room that night whose families certainly would have been affected by such a ban. So it was funereal, I would say.
You led, in part, the Obama administration response to Ebola. Can you tell me how you think the response to the pandemic has been, particularly in terms of international leadership and international cooperation?
I think what one sees in President Obama's response to the Ebola epidemic that one doesn't see in the corona response is one major power, in the case of Ebola, the United States, leading. President Obama declaring that he is going to send 3,000 American troops and health workers into the eye of the storm, into West Africa, to try to support local efforts. As we all know, that success rises and falls on the work of the brave people on the ground. And so in that support role, he then goes to the other countries of the United Nations, taps people like me and John Kerry and others to go and say, okay, here's what we're doing. We're building 17 Ebola treatment units. What are you prepared to do? We're going to take a leadership role in the country of Liberia. United Kingdom, could you take Sierra Leone? France, how about Guinea? China, how many Ebola treatment units are you going to be building? Cuba, you're famous for your medical corps that works in sub-Saharan Africa. How many doctors and health workers can you send to West Africa? And so the United States wasn't the world's policeman then. It was a kind of catalyzer of global action, and it leveraged what it was doing globally to try to get other countries to pool their resources to solve a collective action problem. Because we all knew that if Ebola wasn't contained, it wasn't just going to wipe out life in West Africa, it was going to spread well beyond that, including to the United States, to Europe, and to major cities everywhere. So the COVID response, though, is different. The United States is not leading within international organizations. The UN Security Council, which I led it for the first time in the UN's history to declare Ebola a threat to international peace and security, hasn't even made that modest proclamation at this stage of a pandemic that has infected more than 3 million people around the world. The WHO, the United States, has pulled back funding at the height of a global pandemic, which is sort of like an Onion cartoon headline, but actually is happening in our lifetimes. And instead of leading within an international institution like the UN or it's an agency like the World Health Organization, the United States is hunkering down, inviting a kind of hoarding process globally, racing rightly for a vaccine, but making it very clear that anything that we manufacture and produce is something that we are going to, keep close. And indeed, banning U.S. aid from funding NGOs that might be providing protective equipment to people in the developing world where the pandemic is just now beginning to wall up vulnerable communities. So it's really, really different.
You've seen some of the richest countries on earth really struggling. I'm here in New York City, which has had a very bad time. How worried are you about the more vulnerable countries on earth? I give you an example. Central African Republic, for a population of nearly 5 million people, they apparently have 3 ventilators.
Yeah, they have 3. The country of South Sudan has 4. I think there are fewer than 200 doctors in all of South Sudan. I think, again, one has to think about both dimensions to this pandemic. There is the public health dimension and the fact that with an absence of ventilators, with an absence of basic treatment facilities, you're probably, in many, many countries, and there is variance in how this pandemic is hitting communities. And so, again, the science on this is a bit murky at the present. But in many, many countries that don't have the health infrastructure to withstand what is coming at them, you're going to see massive loss of life, a much higher concentration of loss of life than in developed countries like ours that are struggling so much as it is. But well beyond the health dimension, there's the economic dimension. These are countries that don't have $2 trillion stimulus packages that are going to be brought forth, where when markets shut down, when social lockdowns occur, when communities actually do their best to observe guidelines that are needed from a public health perspective, that wipes out the economic possibilities of people who are living often hand to mouth. And so the knock-on effects in terms of malnutrition and outright starvation, the World Food Program is now warning that 265 million people are at risk of severe malnutrition, and in some cases, what the head of the WFP has referred to as a famine of biblical proportions. So again, it's the health and the economic together with no cushion and very little ability to be resilient because so many of these communities are living on the edge.
You've talked about the Trump administration's decision to cut funding to the World Health Organization because they say that it's too close to China. Can I raise that point with you? Does President Trump have a bit of a point there? China is growing more powerful in the international system, managing to silence parts of the UN system, particularly on issues of human rights.
The best recipe for China to increase its influence in international organizations is for the United States to pull back, and that is what the U.S. has been doing since January 20th, 2017, at noon. The U.S. has been pulling out of international agreements, pulling away from its democratic allies, indeed insulting its democratic allies. At the same time, it praises dictatorships and dictators, even like Kim Jong-un and certainly President Xi. And in that vacuum, where the U.S. walks away, the number 2 donor to the United Nations, China, which had overtaken Japan just a couple years ago as the number 2 donor to the UN, is definitely going to take advantage of that opportunity to try to throw its weight around in more significant ways. And you see that in the Chinese government's effort to get its personnel into more places, to try to offset what is perceived to be an American advantage of decades of U.S. leadership within these organizations and decades of putting U.S. personnel in places of influence. You see it during the pandemic, absolutely, where the World Health Organization senior officials could have been more outspoken, particularly about the stonewalling, I think, that the Chinese government was doing for those critical weeks in January and February. There was the bad information that was provided, there was the insufficient amounts of information that was provided, but then there was the WHO's attempt to gain access to China, where Beijing clearly didn't want external scrutiny to what was happening in Wuhan because they were in the midst of a cover-up. And so at that time, again, with U.S. leadership, it is the job of the United States, other democratic countries, other countries that believe in transparency and accountable governance, to make it impossible for the World Health Organization to sustain any reticence on an issue of this global import. And that didn't happen. The United States wasn't even present. Its seat on the executive board of the WHO was vacant. It was $200 million in a not paid its dues to the WHO even before Trump's more recent funding cutoff. And the other democracies of the UN haven't yet adjusted to self-organize, absent that kind of catalytic role that the U.S. has played for a while. That may be changing now, as we see with the Solidarity Fund and the effort to raise money for developing countries.
How should the US deal with a more assertive China? Because it is, of course, complicated. China is an important part of the global economic system. And do you have worries that this issue is just going to get more toxic? Now we've got all the discussion about the pandemic and the possibility that China now could become a big issue in the US election.
I am worried. I'm worried about China's actions, for starters, because, again, we have now the global ramifications of authoritarian capitalism, a model that people were praising until quite recently, and yet you see in a culture of fear and a climate of fear how afraid local officials were in China to step forward. You saw China, as it was attempting to sort of hide the numbers and downplay the epidemic, expelling Western journalists from China. So we also don't have independent voices able to move around China to really alert the outside world, even to what is happening right now behind Chinese borders. So I worry about that. I think for a long time, U.S. officials have been quite reticent on issues like the detention of the Uyghurs, for example, or on the real risks associated with the export of artificial intelligence and surveillance technologies, of course, that are becoming more pronounced as part of what is perceived to be the remedy for this epidemic. So we can worry about what's happening in China and what China is seeking to export. I think that's a genuine worry.
Let me take you now to the Middle East and back to your time when you were the US ambassador to the UN. In a previous interview for this programme, you told me, when I wake up in the morning, I think of Syria. When I go to bed at night, I think of Syria. And it was very interesting reading your book and the passages on Syria, particularly on that red line on chemical weapons, President Obama's red line that was crossed and he didn't take action. What was interesting to me is that he initially decided to take military action and even set a date for it, August 25th, 2013.
I appreciate you noticing that, James, because there is a little news in that book, I think, given the way some of these histories have been written. Absolutely. President Obama asked me to go to Ban Ki-moon and request that he remove the weapons inspectors who were on the ground looking into the ghastly chemical weapons attack of August 2013 that had killed 1,400 people, including more than 400 children. And I went to Ban Ki-moon knowing that once those inspectors left Syria, that President Obama would be following through on his pledge to hold the Syrian government accountable for such a gross violation of international law. And Ban Ki-moon said no. He said, no, I want the inspectors to do their work. The UN system would have applauded that decision because many were very unenthusiastic about the use of U.S. military force, even though now many of those same people are very critical of how President Obama handled the crisis. But President Obama was good to go. The targets had been chosen, and it was really just a question of not wanting to see the Assad regime holding UN inspectors as human shields and compounding an already devastating humanitarian situation. I should note that the military action that was contemplated was very limited. It was about deterring the use of future chemical weapons. It was not about creating a safe zone or civilian protection areas or carving out large swaths of Syria, again, where civilians might be able to take shelter. So it was limited. But I think when one looks back, one wonders, would just a limited use of force been able potentially to at least deter the future use of chemical weapons, thereby taking out of Assad's arsenal a weapon that he had used for strategic advantage on the battlefield.
What do you think would have been the outcome if he had staged military action? Because remember, this was a year before Russia got involved, and Russia's involvement was what turned the tide. When Russia got involved, the opposition had been doing well and making gains. Could things have turned out very differently? Was this the turning point in the war?
I think it was the turning point insofar as from that point forward, President Assad felt quite confident that there would be no U.S. military involvement in Syria. I will say, as one who was in the Situation Room from 2013 to January 20th, 2017, It never felt like a closed case to me. It always felt like something that was being litigated, that we were thinking creatively, is there some way that this issue can be reopened? But in retrospect, because President Obama decided to use that time before the inspectors came out to go to Congress, the U.S. Congress, and to seek congressional support. So from that point on, I think both President Assad and the key architects of his vicious campaign felt much more confident. And I think you see that as they gradually escalate their bombing campaigns, including in places like Aleppo, where there's just no regard for civilian life whatsoever.
You describe what it was like in the Situation Room. You've described President Obama's views, but there's one figure who also seemed to be opposed in your descriptions in your book to the use of force, and that was the Vice President, Joe Biden. When talking about Libya, you write, Biden had grown dubious about using US military force. He regretted having supported the invasion of Iraq and consistently advocated for winding down the war in Afghanistan. You talk of his skepticism of new military engagement. Does this tell us anything about the Joe Biden who's trying to become Commander-in-Chief?
I think so, but I think it tells us something that is a broadly shared view, certainly across the United States, but I also think across the broader Middle East, which is that military force is never going to resolve the root causes of a conflict. It just isn't going to happen. And yes, it's true that Vice President Biden was deeply affected, I think, by the fact that his son Beau served in Iraq, that feeling of vulnerability for someone you love so much. So many American families have gone through that with people on their 7th, 8th tours in Afghanistan, or those who served 4 tours in Iraq, thought they were done because the U.S. had withdrawn, and then with ISIS ended up back in a training role. And so, it really is the case that local actors, hopefully with appropriate U.S. training, not blank checks, but training in international humanitarian law, pressure and engagement on issues of governance, which themselves have fueled extremism in so many parts of the Middle East, but that there's a tool in the toolbox, and that the U.S. over-reliance on military force has really skewed American foreign policy, and it hasn't delivered the kinds of results, I think, that the American people, but also the broader global public need. And so I think the Vice President's view is we've got to invest much more in diplomacy. President Trump has ravaged our diplomatic corps. We have to do much better on the economic side, bringing in the private sector, pushing on the corruption front. I think the way that Vice President Biden has embraced Elizabeth Warren's anti-corruption agenda should resonate in the Middle East in ways large and small. But the United States is also a lot more effective on issues like that when it's acting with its partners and when we're acting multilaterally.
You write a lot in your book about Syria and about Libya. You barely mention Yemen, yet that was a conflict started by Saudi Arabia and the UAE on your watch, and the Obama administration didn't speak out against it, yet it's now become the worst humanitarian disaster on earth. Do you have regrets?
I certainly have regrets about our Yemen policy, absolutely. And I think that it was one thing in the first instance when the Yemeni ambassador to the United Nations, and you remember this day, came to the UN and said, my country has been overrun. I've had to escape my capital city in hiding to avoid Lord knows what. Help. When a sovereign head of state comes, and this is not a sovereign head of state who had forfeited his claim to international legitimacy like someone like Assad or Gaddafi, but when that Houthi militia takeover of Sana'a and takeover of large parts of Yemen happened, I think it was very reasonable to come to the aid of the sovereign government. And indeed, you mentioned didn't criticize the Saudi coalition. It went much further than that. The United States actually supported what Saudi Arabia was doing militarily by providing intelligence and military support of all kinds. I think the problem was that very soon into the Saudi-led campaign, it became clear that Saudi Arabia was very interested in our money, our intelligence, and our weapon systems, but not very interested in our advice or our legal counsel, for example, on which targets could be struck and which targets could not be struck. And I think at that point, that was really the time to turn off the spigot and to say, there are too many violations of international humanitarian law happening. If you want to learn, just like we had to learn in Afghanistan and Iraq about how to discipline this fight. I mean, you're losing hearts and minds every day on the ground in Yemen. It's in your interest to learn. Then we are here to provide that counsel. And we sent lawyers, to engage the Saudi government at all times, but there was so little receptivity to our counsel in that conflict. And I think absolutely we should have pulled the plug on assistance to the Saudi-led effort. And I don't know that would have changed Mohammed bin Salman's calculus. I don't know that would have caused him to reassess his own agenda. But here we are all these years later. No progress has been made from the Saudi standpoint militarily, if anything, the opposite. And all that this war has meant for the people of Yemen is heartache, disease, starvation, and bombardment. And so no one can look back at this and not have regrets, frankly.
The mastermind of that Saudi-led war in Yemen was the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He's been accused of human rights abuses. He's been accused of murdering the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Do you think it's time for the US to recalibrate its relationship with Saudi Arabia?
I think it has long been time. I mean, in many ways, I think public and even political understanding of the US-Saudi relationship is forged in a different era, at a different time of US great vulnerability in terms of energy dependence on Saudi Arabia, on fears about Saudi Arabia as it related to Israel and the Saudi agenda there, fears that Saudi Arabia also would allow the inculcation of terrorism or abet it in some fashion. And I think if you look at Saudi Arabia's interests as it perceives its interests now, many of the issues that the United States has been pushing for a long time and believes it needs its leverage to secure cooperation on are issues that Saudi Arabia seems to believe it is in its own interest to pursue. I think the Saudi-Israeli relationship is different and changed. Saudi Arabia's own relationship to terrorism, but also its broader support, for example, people like al-Sisi, who lumps together members of the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS and treats them as one. You see Saudi Arabia pursuing policies on its own, and you see it, as in the case of Yemen, very reluctant to take U.S. counsel as it relates to the conduct of its war in Yemen, the conduct, of course, as it relates to something like journalists, whether a journalist like Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Turkey or journalists inside Saudi Arabia. And again, from the standpoint of U.S. interests, U.S. national interests, we don't need to be.
Finally, Ambassador, you have a most compelling biography. Born in Dublin, immigrant to the US, war correspondent, academic, human rights activist, professor, government official, cabinet member and ambassador. What is next for Samantha Power? Many have talked of you as possibly serving in a Joe Biden administration if he wins in November's election. Some have even said you could be the next Secretary of State.
What is next is doing everything in my power, whatever the limits of those powers are. I'm going to test those limits to get Joe Biden elected. I think I would be honored to serve again in some fashion. I think after this presidency, the Trump presidency, I feel all of us feel a duty, to do whatever we can, whether in our own communities or at a national level. So I'd be honored to serve. But my priority, again, is getting Joe Biden back into the White House.
Ambassador Samantha Power, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thanks, James.
As the world fights the corona pandemic,
we're learning more about this every day. It's a new pathogen.
Join our global community.
It's up to us how we come together to fight this.
Answering your questions.
Can I just ask you something absolutely directly that's coming on YouTube? As you were saying, I'm concerned about the front line.
Oh, that's a great question.
Keeping you up to date.
And we've seen countries beat it back and beat it back successfully.
The Stream on Al Jazeera.
We know what's happening in our region. We know how to get to places that others cannot. The fires are still ongoing. The way that you tell the story is what can make a difference.
Hello again, Peter Dobby here in Doha. The top stories from Al Jazeera. The Independent Police Complaints Council in Hong Kong says the force generally acted within guidelines during last year's protests, though it said there was room for improvement. The watchdog has been looking into allegations of misconduct and brutality.
Now, in the past 8 months, we have seen, in fact, protests which originally were peaceful. They then degenerated into violent protests, using weapons of all kinds, in fact, against police and others. Property was destroyed. And this was the situation that our police force was faced with. When they are faced with this situation, of course, they have to enforce the law and they have to protect themselves.
Thailand is further easing restrictions to get its economy moving once again. Department stores, shopping centres and food courts will begin reopening on Sunday. The nightly curfew has also been reduced, but international flights remain banned, which is bad news for the vital tourism industry. Scott Heidler has more now from Bangkok on the efforts to restart businesses across the country.
This is Central World here in the shopping district of the capital, Bangkok. This is one of many complexes in this part of the city. Now, this is the plaza in front of it. It'd normally be teeming with shoppers from abroad and also Thais doing their shopping here. Now, this is one of the venues that's going to open up on Sunday, May 17th. That's part of phase 2 the government has announced in their relaxation of COVID-19 restrictions. This is good news for those who run these malls and those who own the shops inside and the restaurants. They're also going to open those with social distancing. Now, it's very good news here because at least there's going to be some kind of commerce going, but there's still a major question mark over the economy of this nation.
I think Thailand has been on the right track, and it's impressive that we've seen coordination between all groups in the society. I think sentiment has been improving